Hello, welcome back to Behind the Faders, the lifestyle channel. A few weeks ago we talked about the low end. So today we move up a register to low mids. And while the low end might be the most challenging frequency range, not so much in terms of mixing, but in terms of system engineering and system designing, low mids are the most fascinating and surprising range of frequencies. If you want to know why, keep on watching this video. A little bit of history first. When I started in this business, seriously started, it was like the late 80s, early 90s. And back then, low mids were a problem. They were kind of the last thing that hadn't really been figured out by the manufacturers. So they had loud horns for the high mids, they had tweeters for the high end. They pretty much figured out the low end. I mean, not like we know it today, but it was punchy and impressive and all good. But low mids always sounded kind of weak, not for the lack of power, it was more the lack of phase coherence inside this horn. So they were kind of weak and a little bit phasey. So what we used to do was we turned them down. So the usual system controlling back in those days was a four-way analog active crossover, and we'd kind of dial in a smiley face EQ into that crossover. So subs on 0, low mids -3, also horns -3 because they were so harsh, and then treble back to 0. That's how we ran the PA system. Also, this meant that loud shows back then, so a loud rock show was always like painfully loud because most of that volume was driven by the horns. Yes, of course, there was a lot of low end, but this volume was driven by the horns, so it was always harsh. It was painfully loud. And then around the mid-90s, things changed finally. Manufacturers figured out the low mids. And a big moment for me was I came across a PA system made by a small company out of Braunschweig, Brunswick. The company was called Syrinx. They started off making car hi-fi, and then they moved into making PAs. And they had designed a cabinet that was just perfectly mechanically time-aligned. And this cabinet had the strongest low mids, or nicest low mid I had heard until that point. And that for me was a game changer. Because now all of a sudden loud also meant nice and loud. You had warmth. I mean, all the instruments have their ground notes in the low mids, but somewhere between 150 and maybe 300 hertz. The texture, the character, all lies in that frequency range. And before that, we were always told if you want to display multiple instruments in a mix side by side, you need to give each instrument its own frequency range to make them kind of lock together and sit nicely in that mix. All of a sudden, that wasn't necessary anymore, because if you have a strong low mids, instruments separate themselves from each other just by having a different texture and a different ground note. Imagine this is if I gave you a test and I let you listen to the same note from various different instruments, from, I don't know, a guitar and an accordion and saxophone, whatever it is. Just the middle section of a note, so no attack or anything. But I only let you listen to 4K and upwards. You would hardly know which is which. They would pretty much sound the same. If I repeat that test, but now I give you the low mid area of all these instruments, you would know exactly which is which. So again, that was a game changer for me. And so all international manufacturers kind of caught up with it, and now we had strong low mids. But from the technical standpoint, so if you had two speakers side by side, technically the low mids were still a mess. They were not clean, but they were a mess in a way that sounded pleasant to our ears. And now something surprising happened. Line arrays came up. And now with the line arrays, for the first time, we had really clean low mids. And guess what? We didn't really like how that sounded. I remember Big Mick told me a story when Metallica was still playing clubs, which was around that time, I don't know, 97, 98 maybe. And they played in Hamburg in a club called Docks. And that's where Big Mick came across his first line array. It was probably a VDOS system. And he said to the local guy, "Are you sure that this is enough PA?" And the local guy said, "Yeah, don't worry." So you listen to music and you turn it up, and he thought, this is far not loud enough. And he wanted to tell the guy, and he opened his mouth and it was like, and that's when you realize how loud it really was. And then the guy showed him the dB meter. It was really, really loud, but the low were so clean that it didn't really sound loud. Another story is that the company I was mostly working for back then was approached by Electro Voice. They wanted to show us their brand new X-ray system, which was a pretty complicated system. I remember there was various different elements that you had to combine in a certain way. So what they did is they rented a venue in Hanover and they hung a banana of their X-ray. And for comparison, they kind of randomly stacked up some of their speakers somewhere in the corner. So we could A/B. And while the measurement showed that this array sounded a lot better on paper, we all agreed that this random pile of boxes in the corner sounded nicer to us, warmer. So it turns out there's a certain amount of distortion and phase incoherence that our ears really like, and they perceive it as being warm. I mean, the entire discussion about the warm analog sound, like vinyl versus digital, it's all because of that, because of the distortion in all the chaos that happens in the low mids, up to a point. If it gets too much, like in the very old days, we don't like it anymore. But the certain amount of distortion that we like. Of course, now over the years and decades, we kind of adapted to the sound of line arrays and we got used to it. But every now and then, when I come to a club with an old conventional PA system, I still experience that. And it becomes evident every time we tune a PA system using Smart or any measurement software. Because when we listen to it after the software says, now it sounds great, we always bring back a lot of low mids to make it sound pleasant. When it comes to mixing in the low mids, I would divide it into three ranges. You have the low mids, so the warm low mids with all the valuable ground notes and all the texture, which is like 150 to 300. Above that comes an area which I would call the muddy area, between like 400 to 700, that you have to be careful with when you EQ your system, and then when you do the sound check and everything plays. And I always encourage you to think like many signals might not need anything to be done to them, but listen carefully to this area. Try to pinpoint any buildup, because that will sound muddy in your mix. And also above that, from 700 to like close to 1K, which I consider the nasal part of it, same thing. Listen carefully and see if you find any buildup there and take it out just a little, so it just cleans up your mix. And that's all about the low mids I wanted to tell you today. Comments or questions in the comment section. A lot of questions. Consider booking yourself a coaching call. They start at 15 minutes. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel or give me a like. It's all free for you and it helps me so much. And I'll see you around. Bye-bye.